Hey friends, Matt aka Martin here, and in this video I want to share with you a cool way that you can control audio effects with any MPE controller for cool, expressive and performative live performance effects. Using this technique you can control multiple parameters inside of Live using the pressure of various MIDI notes on the same MIDI channel, which is a really great way of creating cool and tactile effects. So for this to work you'll need some kind of MIDI controller that can output polyphonic aftertouch or pressure. For this I'm going to be using the Launchpad Pro Mark III. You can also use the Ableton Push 2 or any other MPE enabled controller. First, I'm going to demonstrate this technique so you get a bit of a feel for what I'm talking about. Here I've got this excerpt from a track that I've been working on and it sounds like this. On this track, I've got 3 audio effect racks, each of which have a single macro. And each of these macros are controlled by the first 3 notes up from C1 on my Launchpad Pro. You'll see as I press the first note, it controls the first macro, the second note controls the second macro, and the third note controls the third macro. But I can have all of these macros actually being controlled independently at the same time using the pressure control of this Launchpad, which when used in practice ends up sounding really cool and can be quite expressive. Now, of course, these could be any audio effects that you like. It could be multiple audio effects. You could have a large audio effect rack that's being controlled here, but let me show you how to set this up for yourself. So first off, what you'll need is an audio track with the audio effects on it that you want to control, or whatever other tracks that you're using, whatever other parameters you want to control, you'll need access to them. Then go ahead and create a MIDI track. On this MIDI track, we're going to go to the input-output section and set the input to the controller that we want to use to control these parameters. I'm going to use the Launchpad Pro Mark III MIDI output. You can then set the MIDI channel if you want to. Depending on how complex your project is, depending on how complex your setup is, you may need to be really cautious about what MIDI channel you choose here. In this instance, I'm just going to leave it set to all channels because I don't have any other mappings going on inside of the session. Next, we need to set the monitor mode to in so that we don't need to have the track armed in order to actually receive the incoming MIDI data from our controller. And now if I start playing notes, you'll see that the track is receiving MIDI input. So now in order to map the pressure from a note on our controller to one of those parameters, we're going to use the expression control max for live MIDI effect. So I'm going to search for expression control and add this to my MIDI track. And you'll see that this expression control basically allows us to map incoming MIDI data to any parameter inside of Live. For this, I'm going to go down to the aftertouch MIDI input option, click on the map button, then go back to our audio track and click on the first macro control that we want to control. And now we'll see that as I press down a note on my MIDI controller, the pressure is controlling the amount of this parameter. If I play this, we can actually now perform this effect. A trouble with this is, though, that every single note on our controller is currently controlling this same parameter, right? Not just that first note that we actually want to be controlling that parameter. So now what we have to do is filter out the note message so that only a single note of our choosing is being used to control this parameter. To do this, I'm going to go back to our MIDI track and group this expression control to a MIDI effect rack by right-clicking and clicking on the group option. Now this expression control is inside of a chain inside of our MIDI effect rack. I'm going to open up the chain list, and then in this chain list, I'm actually going to click on the key zone editor. And what this allows me to do is filter the incoming MIDI note data so that this chain only gets triggered by a certain MIDI note or section of MIDI notes. Because the bottom left pad on my Launchpad is C1, I'm actually going to click and drag this zone so that only C1 is being used to trigger this expression control. So now if we go back to the audio track, we can see that when I press down this bottom left pad, that center frequency control moves, but any of the other pads don't move that center frequency control. Now, in order to map the other two parameters that I want to be able to use, I'm going to go back to the MIDI track and I'm going to duplicate this expression control chain by selecting the chain and pressing Command and D. And then I'm going to click and drag this note zone over to C sharp 1. Then I'm going to duplicate this expression control again and click and drag this note zone over to D1. Now all that's left to do is to map these other two expression controls to the parameters that we want. I'm going to go to this second expression control chain, remove that mapping from center frequency, click on map, go back to the audio track and map that to the second audio effect, go back to the MIDI track, go to our third expression control, again, remove that center frequency mapping, click on map, go back to our audio track and map that to this third parameter. And now the first three notes on our MIDI controller are controlling the first three parameters here on this audio track. Pretty cool, right? And you can theoretically do this for up to 128 different MIDI notes or different effects using a single controller. So for example, if you wanted to turn all the 64 pads on a launch pad into effects controllers, you could have one massive effects device, and all of those effects are controlled via the pressure of a single MIDI note. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, I'd love to invite you to leave a like down below and subscribe if you're new. And if you're really enjoying my videos and content, why not consider heading over to my Buy Me a Coffee page where you can support me by buying me a coffee and downloading a bunch of cool Ableton Live resources like samples and racks. There's a link down in the description. So now, depending on your controller, you might find that the sensitivity of the effects controls is a little bit out. And in order to help to fix this or adjust the sensitivity to our liking, we can use another Max for Live device, which also comes with Ableton Live 11 Suite, which is the MPE control device. So I'm going to go back to our MIDI track and I'm going to search for the MPE control device. And I'm going to add this before our MIDI effect rack with the expression controls in it. And what this MPE control device allows us to do is remap the pressure curve of any incoming pressure information. So currently it's set to linear. And if I press down on any of these notes, we can see that movement there. But I can adjust this curve using this control here to make it a little bit more exponential, or I like to actually go to this segmented S-shaped curve here and then unlink these controls and have it set a little bit more like this. And I just like this as a bit of a starting point. You can of course adjust this curve to your liking though. And now if we go back to our audio track, we can see that the movement of these devices is a little bit different. I might adjust the curve a little bit less, and we can also move this center point if we want to as well. Experiment with whatever works for you. You can also adjust the rise and fall amount of the pressure control by going and clicking on this little bottom right arrow here, clicking on the smooth button, and then we can increase the rise and fall amounts so that the transitions smooth a little bit more between when they're pressed and when they're let go. You can also adjust both the pressure curve and the rise and fall amounts for individual expression controls by going to the desired expression control. Let's click on this first one here and click on this top right curve icon. And then if we click on the right side of this aftertouch row, we can adjust the curve for that particular aftertouch parameter and also the rise and fall using these rise and fall parameters here in this expression control device. And so now we have a really cool expressive effects control using our MPE controller. And there you have it. Now you have a really cool effects setup that you can use in a live performance context for some really performative and expressive effects. If you'd like to see how I set up Ableton Live for performance from scratch, check out this video right here. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.